Welcome to Larry the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. And welcome to another edition of Sabbath Sunday. This is where we get together on Sundays to discuss all things Black Sabbath. I'm here, of course, with my podcast and Sabbath Sunday co-host Darren. We have a podcast called Into the Void, a Black Sabbath podcast, where we go album by album through the Black Sabbath catalog, as well as the related solo albums like Ozzy's solo career and Dio. Our latest episode is about to go up on Dio's Last in Line. So I'll leave a link in the description below to our podcast. And the topic for today's video is just more of a, I do a thing on my channel, on the channel called Heavy Thoughts. This is where I always say I take a moment to talk about what's been on my mind lately. And maybe this is a Heavy Thoughts for Sabbath Sunday. It's something that me and Darren have been discussing on our own. And that's this idea of why do Black Sabbath fans tend to have such a strong emotional connection to certain singers in the band. And what got us thinking about this is that lately we've been doing episodes where we did a 5 least favorite of Tony Martin, a 5 favorite songs from the Tony Martin era. We just did a 5 least favorite Ozzy era songs. And we've done episodes now on Born Again, Ian Gillan. We've done other various things with Dio, about the Dio era. And we noticed that with Black Sabbath fans, they're very, very passionate, and they almost take it personal when you're discussing the singers in the band. And when we did our least favorite Tony Martin songs, we got a whole bunch of people that, came at us about, doing this least favorite thing, maybe thought we were being too critical of some of these Tony Martin era songs. So when we did our 5 favorite Tony Martin era songs, we almost had the opposite reaction, where a lot of people came in and just very passionately wanted to say this isn't real Black Sabbath, or this era is, they didn't care for the Tony Martin era. So it's an interesting thing, and it's something that me and Darren have been talking about, and we thought we would bring it here to Sabbath Sunday about, what is it about Black Sabbath the band, and maybe what is it about maybe their history, their catalog, and the singers that they've had in their band that, other bands have gone through singer changes, but there's just something about Black Sabbath that people get real passionate, and it gets really personal for people with specific eras of the band. So that's what we're here for today, kind of a Heavy Thoughts episode. So Darren, why don't you kick us off with your heavy thoughts on this subject?
So when we started doing our podcast, the very first episode we did was Ozzy versus Dio, because I thought that was a good way to get our feet wet, and that it was a pretty controversial thing and an ongoing thing. So it seemed to me at the time that it was predominantly the two singers, Ozzy and Dio, that caused the most conflict from one fan to another. But as we moved on, and through the podcast, and especially through our Sabbath Sundays, was when it really became more noticeable that it's not so much Ozzy and Dio; it's every singer that's ever sung for Sabbath. You'll have so for instance, when we started talking about Born Again, in some of the comments and even some of the people that we were talking to, there was a strong defense of Ian Gillan, and in the comments people would say, well, what's the best Black Sabbath album? And it sort of voids out the Ozzy era, and it's better than the Dio era. It's the best Black Sabbath. It's my favorite. And someone wanted to say it's the best. So now you throw another singer into the ring. So now you've got Ozzy, Dio, and Gillan. And then you start getting into the Tony Martin thing. And we started as innocently enough. We decided that because you had already done a video of your favorite Tony Martin songs. So we decided we were going to pick our least favorite Tony Martin songs. And it wasn't that easy, because there's a lot of good songs from the era. And under this, and we prefaced our segment by saying this doesn't mean that we don't like Tony Martin. It doesn't mean that we're qualifying him as a singer. These are just the songs from his era that we're not really that crazy about. And then we explained it. We were, you know, pretty respectful of Tony Martin, his voice, and Black Sabbath in general. But yet in the comments, a lot of people got really upset. How we don't deserve Tony Martin, you know, and there's a lot of people that were defending the honor of Tony Martin based on our criticisms, and that's cool. I mean, I love to discuss Sabbath in any way, you know, even if it's through an argument or a disagreement. It's still fun. If we all agree, it gets kind of boring. So it's fun to disagree, and it's fun to have spirited discussions. And sometimes, you know, one person will make the other one think about things that they weren't thinking about prior to the discussion or the argument. So then, as an alternative to the least favorite Tony Martin, we decided we were going to do our favorite Tony Martin songs. And then we're thinking, well, this will probably have a lot of people contributing. All the people that were in defense of Tony Martin will probably now join in and say, you know, yeah, I like those songs too, but here's some other ones that I'm also really fond of. But instead, we had people that were coming out against Tony Martin. And it's like, well, wait a minute now. Where's the other people that were defending Tony Martin, and why aren't they jumping into this discussion? They were nowhere to be found, at least not that I could see. Or if they were, they weren't protesting the people that were criticizing Tony Martin. And again, that's good. It's all good. You don't like Tony Martin, you do like Tony Martin. You don't like Ian Gillan, you do like Ian Gillan. You like Dio, you don't like Dio. You hate Ozzy, you love Ozzy, whatever. But the thing about it is that people get so emotionally attached to these singers that they feel like it's their responsibility almost to I mean, there was one guy that was going from thread to thread, from comment to comment, and responding to people. People were like, well, I've never really, for the last video we did of our favorite Tony Martin, there were some people said, well, you know, I never really got into the Tony Martin era. And one guy was like, well, that's because it's not any good. You know, it's like made it his own person. It wasn't content just to leave his own comment saying, hey, you know, I don't like it. But he also had to that wasn't enough. He had to like blow off some more steam and go down the line and, you know, I contribute more to really reinforce the fact that he hated Tony Martin, or didn't qualify the Tony Martin era of Black Sabbath as true Black Sabbath. And that's cool. It was fun. But it does make you wonder, what is it that gets people so worked up to defend one singer over another, and to the point where they would defend or praise one singer at the expense of another? You know, Dio is so much better than Ozzy. Okay, well, maybe, but it doesn't mean that he may be a better singer technically, but it doesn't mean that he's a better vocalist for Black Sabbath. Some people prefer one over the other. I don't have that kind of an attachment to any of the singers. I prefer the Ozzy era. That's when I came on board. It's what I listened to the most. But you know, I love the Dio era. I love Tony Martin era. You know, I wasn't that crazy about Born Again. Wouldn't say I don't like it. About 50-50 with Born Again. The only problem I have is the production, and we've talked about that. But you know, my point is that I like all of Black Sabbath. It's like Black Sabbath is like a road that you travel down. There's where you start, and then that's where you go a little way, and then you encounter the Dio era. Then you go down a little bit further, and there's Ian Gillan, and then you know you keep going, and then it's like kind of a journey, and it's cool. And there's different musical expressions along the way. There's differences in production. You can tell the stuff that was recorded in the 70s. You can tell the stuff that was recorded in the 80s and the 90s, and then thereafter. It's pretty cool to look at it that way. That, you know, being a fan of Black Sabbath is like taking a journey. You're along for the ride as long as it lasts. We may have reached the end of the road, but looking back, there's a lot of good music that came out along the way, and that's how I kind of prefer to look at it. I don't want to diminish or to limit my fondness for Black Sabbath to only a certain decade or to a handful of albums. You know, I'm a Black Sabbath fan, and I want to like the legacy of Black Sabbath and everything. And it doesn't mean that, you know, one fan
Yeah.
who only likes maybe the Ozzy era isn't as much of a Black Sabbath fan. But it's just curious that people want to stop at one point and not move further down that road. So
Yeah, I think with Black Sabbath, you have a couple different dynamics going on. And for any band, and you sort of mentioned this, where somebody's entry point is, that tends to be uh, the one that they have the best memories for, because it's what got them into the band.
mhm.
So if you're an Iron Maiden fan and that was Fear of the Dark, then you know that's your album. There's a lot of people that discovered Black Sabbath during the Dio era, Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules. So for them, Dio is number one, and maybe the Ozzy era is just too different from the Dio era for them. So there's that. The other thing is that Black Sabbath has had a long career. They've put out 19 studio albums, I believe. I would say that, okay, of course, there's people that like the different eras and stuff, but they've had a pretty strong run. They never really had a phase where, like Genesis, where the Peter Gabriel era Genesis is way different than the MTV Phil Collins era Genesis, where there's just like almost like two completely different bands. Yes, the Tony Martin era is very different than the Ozzy era, but it's still somewhat connected there. There's a continuum from album to album. So I think that they have a lot of really strong albums. And it's not a case like with Iron Maiden and Judas Priest, with Blaze and Ripper. When those albums came out, it was in the 90s. The bands, both those albums didn't sell well and everything. Black Sabbath has had pretty decent selling records with various singers. Of course, the Ozzy era sold very well. The Dio era sold very well. Ian Gillan, Born Again, that sold well. Seven Star, not as well as those, but it was still pretty decent. The Tony Martin era, maybe not so much, but still, you know, it was still, some of those records did do pretty decent. Headless Cross. And so I think that there's all those dynamics going on. It's really easy to feel real passionate about any particular era because there's really good albums from every era of the band. And I think when it comes to like Tony Martin, for instance, it's such a there's good records there, and there's a lot of people that really like those records, and they kind of feel like they need to sort of wave a flag for that era of the band, like, hey everybody, you are missing out on this. If you slept on this, and part of it is that these Tony Martin era albums have been out of print forever. They're supposed to put them in a box set soon. Fingers crossed that happens. But for a lot of people, man, if you weren't there to grab these things when they first came out on CD, you just may not know about that era of the band just because you can't find the music anywhere. And so I think there's a lot of people when it comes to like the Tony Martin era, like, okay, I've got to wave the flag for this, and hey, everybody, you're missing out on this. When it comes to, again, like there's such strong albums from every era, and these albums are so good. I mean, there's the Heaven and Hell, Mob Rules, Paranoid, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. These are all such great albums that people get really emotionally attached to them. And so they get attached to a certain era. Or for like us, what we talk about on the podcast all the time, we were sort of there going through. We came in, 1980, Dio was in the band, but it was sort of Ozzy. We were getting the Ozzy stuff and the Dio stuff at the same time. And then we were there as they went through all these different albums. So we sort of developed, we were there when they came out. So we sort of followed them along on this journey. And it is puzzling because before we started the video, we were trying to think of another band where there's been multiple singer changes and people are this passionate about all the different singers and have different strong opinions on all the different singers. And, we mentioned Iron Maiden, but if you lined up 100 Iron Maiden fans, probably 98 out of 100 would say they like the Diano and the Bruce era. You wouldn't, doesn't feel quite as divided between Bruce and Paul Diano when it comes to Iron Maiden. And even a situation like AC/DC, well, Bon Scott died, so there was no, they had to get another singer. Talk about Van Halen, but Van Halen is sort of the inverse. Like, I've met people that like the Van Hagar era, of the Sammy Hagar era of the band, but I don't know if I've ever met somebody that liked the Sammy Hagar era better than the David Lee Roth era. People that like both, but never like, maybe people do get pretty spirited about Van Halen. But yeah, there's something about Black Sabbath, that their music, I think people make such a connection with their music that certain singers really hold a special place for them. And then people feel like, they need to, when somebody attacks that singer or that era of the band, they feel like they need to come to its defense.
It could be. Yeah, it could definitely be that. I think Black Sabbath definitely hits the emotional core with a lot of people. And I think particularly the Ozzy era, most of the lyrical subject matter was more of an internal relevance, emotional topics and things like that. And I think some people really took that and made a emotional investment in that material. And so then when someone else comes along and they have a different, like with Dio, when Dio came along, and the lyrics weren't as emotionally relevant. They were more of some of it was fantasy based, some of it was more of a conceptual, what Sabbath had kind of built up as their image, medieval castles and things like that. So it sort of shifted, and the people that were more emotionally invested with the Ozzy era, I think, were kind of alienated by what came after. And I can understand that if you really made that much of an emotional investment in that material, and it's easy to do. What you said about when you came into Sabbath bears a lot of relevance to what becomes your favorite. And a lot of people got into Sabbath around 1980 when Dio joined. Heaven and Hell was an album that made a big impact. And so then you start out with making the investment in intellectual, emotional investment in the music and the lyrics that are presented in those two albums. And so you get kind of settled on that. And then you look back and you can identify with the Ozzy era because there's some songs that carried over into the Dio era. So you're familiar with that material, but maybe you're just more invested in the Dio, and that's kind of where you want to stay, but you can acknowledge what happened before, but you don't have as much of a connection with that. And then, so you move on from there, and then Ian Gillan comes in, and there it either alienates you or maybe it's a starting point. But it seems like it's more difficult that if you, and this is what I've kind of gathered from reading some of the comments, it's more difficult for people that the stronger the investment, the more of an attachment there is, and it's harder to let go of. You become very possessive of that because it becomes part of your identity in a way, or let's say you identify with that. And so when somebody says something about that particular era that you've made such an emotional investment in, it's almost as though they're not just attacking Ozzy, or they're not just attacking Dio, they're not attacking Tony Martin, they're attacking you personally. And that's why there's such a reaction. That's as near as I can figure. And I think that's pretty cool. I'm not complaining about it. It's just an observation that I think, and I've said this before to a lesser degree, that I don't care if your favorite album is an album that I'm not really fond of. If someone takes the time to defend it, that has my total respect. I really appreciate the fact that people take music and make it such a part of themselves, and can get into a spirited debate or discussion in defense of it. I think that's cool. I think it's great when anybody can make an emotional attachment to a record or a band. I think it's cool. But by the same token, we don't necessarily have to fight about it. We can agree to disagree. It's okay. If you like your favorite Black Sabbath album is Born Again. Well, I don't agree. It's not my favorite Black Sabbath album, but I think that's cool. There's obviously something that resonates with you, and you really, you feel that record, and that's cool. I'm not going to take that away from you. Why would I want to? Why would I want to diminish anything that means something special to someone else? What purpose does that serve? Does that, is that going to make me feel better? I've converted another one. To what gain? I mean, what, I don't know. Maybe it's like for some sort of, sport. I don't know. I mean, nobody gains anything from trying to diminish someone else's love of something that they're not particularly fond of.
Well, and I
But
think
we're moving along with, when we're talking about the bands, and you mentioned Iron Maiden. Like, here's another band that's had singers that, look at Deep Purple. You got Mark One, you got the Rod Evans era, you've got certainly Ian Gillan, which a lot of people, made it, that's probably the most popular one. And then you got the Coverdale era. Now, I've gotten into some debates with friends that they say Burn is their favorite Deep Purple album, or it's the best Deep Purple album, to which I get really angry and I start smashing things because clearly In Rock or Machine Head are the better albums. Not really, but
I'm not going to argue with you on that.
Yeah, right. But it's strange to hear somebody have such, it's like, whoa, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Mark II era is clearly better than Mark III, as far as singers go. But yeah, I mean, it's some people just prefer one thing over another. And at the end of the day, even though it may kind of like make the hair on my neck stand up, I have to realize that, well, not everybody's the same. And there's probably something about Burn that, somebody, that person just really connects with. And for me, it's Machine Head, or it's In Rock. For them, it's Burn, and that's totally cool. We can agree to disagree. But what is it about Black Sabbath that gets people so worked up when it comes to, discussing one singer or another? And I guess that's the question, and I don't think we're going to figure it out. But for an observation, it makes for good conversation, I think.
Well, and I think too, it's almost it's a good thing in some ways, because it shows how strong of a catalog that Black Sabbath has. I'm sure there are fans out there, if we go back to Iron Maiden, that do like the Blaze era. I know people that do like the Blaze era.
Yep, I know them too.
Do they like the Blaze era better than the Bruce or the Di'Anno era? I don't know. Same thing with the Ripper era. And is there anybody that loves the Ripper era but doesn't like any of the Halford albums? Don't know about that. If you're one of those people, leave us a comment down below. That's cool if you're one of those people. I don't think I've ever met them. But with Black Sabbath, because these different eras have been so strong, it's a testament to their catalog that people can get behind, and pretty much any album in their catalog, and really make a strong argument for why it's good. The other thing is, and this could be a topic of a whole nother video, is what do you do when bands that have been around as long as Black Sabbath and they change? All right, their sound over time moves slightly one way or another. Okay, one thing you can do is just say, I like this era. I don't want to have anything to do with this other stuff. It's so far removed. Tear is so far removed from the first Black Sabbath album that it doesn't even sound like the same band. That's what somebody might say, right? So I'm just going to stick with the Ozzy era, or I'm just going to stick with the Tear and Headless Cross. Or you can be somebody, and this is kind of the way I think of it too. When I'm in the mood for Tony Martin era Black Sabbath, I kind of move myself into a different mindset, and I don't listen to the Tony Martin era and think about why doesn't this sound like Sabbath Bloody Sabbath or something. I
Exactly.
sort of separate them like sequels to a movie or
Hmm.
something. They're similar, but they're different. A band that I can think of that also really does this, maybe an extreme example of this would be Opeth. Their early days are death metal. Now they're clearly like a 70s prog type band. There are people that are in one camp or another with that band. I'm in the camp of, if I'm in the mood for the death metal Opeth, I've got them compartmentalized over here, and I listen to it and I enjoy
Sure.
the death metal Opeth, and then I enjoy, at other times I enjoy the 70s prog Opeth. And yes, they're the same band, but in some ways I have to kind of separate them in some ways. They're connected, but I have to separate them in my minds. And anytime you have a band that's had a long catalog like this, Deep Purple is a good example. They have tons of albums. The band has morphed over time, different people coming in and out, different singers, different key members, Richie Blackmore in, Richie Blackmore out. Uh, and these bands change, and I understand, we were talking about this last night to just on our own, about how sometimes you get so invested. Richie Blackmore is my favorite guitar player, and it's so difficult for me to get past that. When I listen to, I'm coming around to it, and it's something I'm working on, but it's hard for me because I'm so invested, and I love Richie Blackmore so much. He's so much the identity. It's kind of like when Thin Lizzy, they briefly were going out as Thin Lizzy, clearly, Phil Lynott had passed away. They put the band back together before they started calling it Black Star Riders. I think am I correct? They actually did some shows calling themselves Thin Lizzy.
Yeah.
I just couldn't,
Well, Brian Downey was in the band, I think, and then Brian Downey was out. But yeah, I mean, it was
but
essentially.
without Phil, it
Dean
was
Campbell was
just
in it at one point, but Black Star Riders is a different lineup. But for all intents and purposes, it only had
right.
one. It was
So it's
Scott
a
Ian.
tricky thing when you have bands that have had long careers, when you have a band like Black Sabbath, where you have very strong contributing members, Geezer, Bill, of course, Tony's been there the whole time. You have very, very identifiable singers like Ozzy. Like Ozzy, even if you're not a fan of Ozzy, you got to admit his voice is very unique. He really stands out. Dio, Glenn Hughes,
Mhm.
Ian Gillan. We're listing some of the greatest singers
Dave
in our life.
Donato.
Tony
We
Martin is
can't forget Dave
amazing.
Donato.
Right, exactly, right. There's been all these great, great singers that have been in Black Sabbath, all these great musicians that have come through the band. So it's easy to understand. I think that's something that's kind of cool about Black Sabbath, that you can sit down, and if you want to, you can throw out Seventh Star, and that there's going to be a lot of people that love that record. There's a lot of people that love Tony Martin. There's a lot of people that, your catalog is just so strong that and that's a good thing, I guess. That's a cool thing. I enjoy the fact that there's people that are passionate about pretty much every album in the Sabbath catalog. I've met people that think that that's their favorite Black Sabbath record, even all the way down to Forbidden. I have a friend that Forbidden is his favorite Black Sabbath album. I mean, so it's just something about Black Sabbath. They're that good. They're that good
But
of a band.
I think there's people that will sort of bridge the whole conflict between singers and just say it doesn't matter to me because Tony Iommi is Black
Sure.
Sabbath. And then most of the times I'll say, yeah, you're right. But then you start to think about it. It's like, well, he is. I mean, he's the most consistent. He's the only consistent member of Black Sabbath. But what's built upon Tony's riffs um, has a lot to do with
Yeah.
Black Sabbath too. The voice that accompanies his guitar from album to album definitely shapes the sound of Black Sabbath. I mean, there is
Yeah.
that common denominator that goes through from album to album. But even when you're talking about, and I think we've mentioned this before, when you're getting into the Tony Martin era, the tone of Tony's Iommi's guitar gets a little bit homogenized. It's not quite as rich. It's not quite the same. that is not always, even though it's the same person playing, the sound of the instrument, the sound of the guitar isn't always the same from album to album. So it's almost not even fair to say that it's all about Tony Iommi, because Tony Iommi has sort of changed the way
Yeah.
that his guitar sounds. You can't compare the tone of his guitar on Tear to the tone of his guitar on Volume 4, Master of Reality. It's not. It's really not very similar at all. But the unfortunate thing about Tony Martin, and I think one of the things that kind of brings that era down a little bit to a lower level, isn't because of the material. It's not because of the music. It's not because of the songwriting. I think it's a lot of it is due to the time that it came out. We were
Yeah.
sort of a real transitional point in music and heavy music. And heavy music, I think it was around a time that we could say Seven Star would be the beginning of that era, even though it wasn't with Tony Martin, it was with Glenn Hughes. But it was sort of like going into that more, I don't know how you describe it, White Snake kind of. What would you call White Snake? What would you call it? British rock, British arena rock.
Yeah.
When it
Yeah.
started getting into that sort of vibe, glam glam metal was sort of on its way out. It was like
Things were getting pretty
it was
slick.
still
Records were
there.
getting very
Yeah.
produced, and
And
it
then
was,
Pantera started, that kind of like, that metal started becoming more popular, and from there, or maybe in the background it was grunge. So there was a lot of things going on. There was a lot of other genres, or a lot of other heavy music subgenres pushing for attention, and it was a lot. It seemed like it was a kind of a conflicted period of time, and Black Sabbath was sort of like cast aside, like, well, that's not really that exciting anymore. That's too 80s, or that's too 70s. It's, it really wasn't. I wouldn't say it wasn't cool, but it wasn't really exciting. It wasn't really as stimulating as some of the other things that were coming up. It wasn't as stimulating, I think, to a younger audience as Soundgarden, Nirvana, or as Pantera, or Rage Against the Machine, or any of the other things that were currently like capturing the attention of the audience that would normally be listening to music like Black Sabbath. So that is kind of unfortunately timed, and because of that, it sort of gets the shaft a little bit. Like somebody had mentioned, like, well, look how many copies of records that they sold in comparison to the other eras. Well, that isn't necessarily a reflection of the quality of the music. That is mostly a reflection of the climate at the time of what was trending. People
yeah.
just weren't buying music like Black Sabbath. I mean, even I think Whitesnake wasn't really even recording it. They took a break, like 87, or what was the last album they did? Like 87,
I don't know.
88,
Yeah,
like
that.
that. I mean, it wasn't, they were like dinosaurs, and Sabbath was basically, kind of a dinosaur, but they kept plugging along, you know.
Yeah.
But so because of that, the time that those records came out, it was just thought of, that the reason they weren't successful was because Tony Martin just wasn't as good a singer as previous years. If they had, I really don't think that if they had Ozzy or Dio, that those records would have sold any better at that particular point in time. I mean, it's hard to prove, but that's my suspicion. So
Yeah.
Tony Martin just had an unfortunate period of time that he was in the band, but it wasn't for lack of talent, and it wasn't for lack of songwriting. But those
Right.
albums are good.
And I would also just throw in there that not only was it in the time and where metal was at that time, but also the fact that leading up to Tony Martin, there had been so many singer and lineup changes that it sort of diluted it was hard for people to get excited about the band. If Tony Martin had came in 1980, if he was the second singer in the band, it would have been a different time frame. And but with the years of constant lineup changes, that really affected the market value of Black Sabbath. And also to note that when Tony Martin came in, Eternal Idol was on Warner Brothers, the label that carried all the previous Sabbath records in the US. But then after that, it went to IRS, which was a smaller label than Warner Brothers was. So it didn't have quite the same you know, backing power behind it that Warner Brothers did, and I'm sure that had an effect on the Martin era also. So
Hmm.
All
I
right.
mean, yeah. Well, what's one last thing? I think even Iron Maiden. I remember. Well, for the last time I saw Black Sabbath, well, not the last time. I saw them since they got Ozzy back. The last time I saw him with Tony Martin, I think that was '95. The venue was originally it was a larger venue, and they weren't selling enough tickets, so it got bumped down to a smaller venue. But that was '95,
Yeah, we were
and
knee deep in grunge at that point.
yeah, and so yeah, that was the odds were stacked
Tough
against
years for
them.
everybody around that
The odds
time.
were stacked against them, and the same thing happened to Iron Maiden. Iron
Yeah,
Maiden went from playing
and Judas
arenas when
Priest.
yeah, and Judas Priest too. And I don't know if it was a direct correlation to the singer they had in the band at the time, or it was just that this just coincidentally happened around the same time. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if it's a statement on you know whether or not the singer had that much to do with the band's popularity, or like I said, what was going on in the background at the time. But yeah, so
All right, well, there you go. Our heavy thoughts here on Sabbath Sunday. So let us know in the comments down below why you guys think that Black Sabbath fans become so emotionally attached to different eras and different singers of the band. Maybe tell us yourself, what is it about a particular era of the band that is special for you, and why you're hold it really close to your heart? What is the reason for the era of the band that you like? Or maybe you're like me and Darren, you like all the eras of Black Sabbath. So let us know in the comments down below. Make sure you check out our podcast, Into the Void, a Black Sabbath podcast, and we will catch you again on the next Sabbath Sunday.